Thank you very much, Nigel, and thanks all of you for coming along. Where's the clicker? So what I'm going to talk about this afternoon is one of the reports which the UK Energy Research Centre, the most recent report actually that the bit of the UK Energy Research Centre that I'm responsible for produced. And as you can see on the screen, the slide, the title of the report is Presenting the Future, an Assessment of Future Cost Estimation Methodologies in the Electricity Sector. And as I'll explain as we go through, what we think might happen to the costs of electricity generation in the future is a particularly important component of the policy decision-making process. And yet relies upon sometimes evidence which is not quite as robust as we might hope it to be. And so we set about, together with colleagues, Phil, who certainly some of the students, energy policy students know, and others set about investigating probably a couple of years ago or so now. Now, just a quick bit of context. So I won't try and read through all of this. UKERC, rather than, because it's a bit of a mouthful, is a consortium. It's funded by the UK government through the UK research councils, which are the bodies that give out money for university research. It's a collaboration between a bunch of the UK's leading universities. It's based at Imperial, but it's not actually run by Imperial. It's more kind of hosted by Imperial for the benefit of the greater community. I'm sure you've read whatever bit of guff we chose to put on the slide. The idea is that it does integrating stuff, whole systems stuff. And in particular, although we very much aspire to do this at Imperial as well, it aims to reach out and engage directly with policymakers. And that's very much what the activity that I am responsible for at UKERC tries to do.
It's a really...
I'm going to pause whilst a few people arrive. I'm Mark. So a little bit of additional stuff on UKERC, which I'm just going to skip through. I don't think we need to know about what we do on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and so on. But just to be clear about where this report originates from, this report originates from something called the Technology and Policy Assessment Theme. I'll put my teeth back in this afternoon. The Technology and Policy Assessment Theme, which is one of UKERC's core activities. And it's really UKERC's principal policy-facing activity. And the important thing to understand about what we do with the TPA is we do kind of meta-analyses, we do systematic reviews, we take snapshots of what's available in the existing literature and evidence base, and we try and kind of synthesize all of that into a form which is digestible for policymakers. Now obviously we try and get academic outputs from that as well, like journal papers and so on, and book chapters, but the principal objective is to take a bunch of very, very complicated stuff and make it simple enough for policymakers, which is not to suggest that policymakers need things to be simple because they're not very clever. Actually, it's far from the truth in many instances. But certainly their appetite for academic detail is rather different from that we might find, you know, amongst the academics in this room, or even amongst research students and so on. So I'll try and explain this slide to you. What you can see here, it's called the context, and it's a bit of like, why did we do this? So what you can see here are some cost estimates for a bunch of different technologies from 2006, which I scarcely believe is 8 years ago, and more recently, from a couple of years ago. And these are estimates. These were used. Both of these are from reports that were prepared for the UK government, or by the UK government, published by the UK government. They've been adjusted for inflation, so it's not because things were cheaper in the middle of the last decade. And what they tend to show is that things have got more expensive in the electricity generation sector. So I keep ringing these two. This is that's the estimated cost of nuclear. And as some of you will be aware, we now have a strike price agreed for the Hinkley nuclear reactor, which is just over £90 per megawatt hour, which is actually right at the upper end of the most recent range of estimates, and certainly shows that what we thought might happen back in the middle of the last decade turned out to be wrong. Some technologies have fared rather better. I'd probably single out onshore wind, where there's been on a plateau, actually, rather than a significant cost increase. And you'll all be aware that fossil fuel prices have moved significantly during that period of time. Now, the interesting thing is that this was completely unanticipated. What we broadly expected was that gas wasn't going to change very much, and that the low-carbon new things were going to get cheaper. And we actually, at that time, you can look back, and we've done this, and I was responsible for some of these analyses. In the early part of the 2000s, we were saying offshore wind, it's going to come down in cost, it will go down a learning curve. So we're investigating this phenomenon, and that's what the report's all about. And I'll try and go through some of our findings and some of the kind of analysis that we've done. So this is, in part, this is a methodological piece of work. There's a large literature in the kind of engineering, economic, innovation theory interface, which is concerned with making judgments about the future, often referred to as the learning curve literature, and I'll come back to talk about that in a moment. I'm sure you've read the slide by now. So we're interested in how good the methodologies are. We're interested in exogenous factors, and I'll explain what I mean by that as we go through, if you like, sideswipes, things that we didn't anticipate. How have we fared in thinking about this question? So how much have we got wrong? How much have we got right? Why have we got things wrong? How was that communicated at the time? And so on. Now, the prevailing wisdom at the moment amongst those entities that are still persuaded in any way that we might make the kind of progress that some of us hope we feel that we need to make towards decarbonising our energy system, the prevailing wisdom is that the decarbonisation of the power sector is terrifically important to the decarbonisation of the economy. One reason for that is that we know that we can decarbonise the power sector, and we might be slightly less sure that we can decarbonise, for example, road transport. It's going to be more difficult. We know, for example, if we wanted to, that we could build enough nuclear reactors to power this country, because we know that they've done that largely in France, for example. But actually, one of the principal drivers of this kind of decarbonisation of electricity agenda is the modelling that's done that underpins the analysis, that informs things like the Stern Review that then go into policy, or directly inform the policy analyses and policy documents themselves. And that modelling tends to take the form of technology-rich cost optimisation models. Some of you might have heard of or be familiar with Markal, which is now becoming a new variant called Times. And the cost input assumptions that are put into those models are absolutely central to driving the outputs of those models and the outcomes and the judgments that follow from them. So these judgments about what we think might happen because of this learning effect, which makes things get cheaper as we use them in larger numbers, and what we might think about fossil fuel prices in the future, really matters to policy. And there is a certain kind of circularity, as it says at the bottom. Policy can also bear upon costs, which bears upon policy. If we believe in this and we go after this and we do roll out technologies in large numbers, to a certain extent, there's a degree to which a self-fulfilling prophecy can be created. But we'll come back to that. So what did we do? We did a systematic review of the evidence on cost forecasting methodologies. That provides a chapter of the report. And that's the kind of academic-y wonky piece for the social science community that are interested in learning curves. We then did a more rapid review of 6 technology case studies that you can see listed. The main options for generating electricity at bulk in the UK, plus photovoltaics, which is a much smaller player at the moment, but which has interesting characteristics and in terms of cost reduction. And then we tried to draw some conclusions. What have I done? Okay. I'm going to put this down now. So there is the methodological dimension to all of this. There's a significant literature on experience curves. Experience or learning curves chart the relationship between volume of production and cost reduction. This relationship was actually first charted coincidentally by a paper by a guy called Wright, but it wasn't one of the Wright brothers, but he was looking at the airframe industry, the manufacture of aeroplanes back in the 1930s. And that relationship was documented for the first time empirically, that for every doubling of the cumulative volume of airplanes manufactured, there was a relationship which could be documented in terms of reduction in costs or prices. That gives rise to something called the learning rate. So you might say the photovoltaic industry typically exhibits a learning rate of 20%. And what that means is if you double the volume of photovoltaic modules sold, the average price stroke cost of those modules would reduce by 20%. And this is widely, it's a bit like Moore's law, you know, for processors getting faster, you know, how many doublings do you get? And obviously this gives rise to an exponential growth pattern. This obviously gives, in terms of cost reductions over time, this gives rise to marketing strategies on the part of manufacturing companies and marketeers. You know. How many of these are we going to be able to sell at an expensive rate before the costs come down, and so on? And it's also the focus of a great deal of academic interest and endeavour. And you can see some of the issues around the use of learning curves on the screen there. So, you know, you can, for example, use assumptions about learning to say, well, what volume of investment do we need? How much money do we need to put in over what time period before we think we might buy this technology down to a point where it's as cheap as we would like it to be? Okay? That's at least a possible application of them. And they can tell us that, you know, we postulate that in whenever it might be, technology X, Y, or Z will be as cheap as the incumbent technologies. One of the reasons that we think that new things might get cheaper and existing things might continue to be more or less as expensive as they already are is that if you've got something which is already deployed extensively, its market has been exploited to a large extent, as greatly as it's possible to do, the potential to kind of get that learning effect is reduced. Okay? You can't double the amount of installed capacity of gas-fired power stations as readily as you can double the installed capacity of photovoltaics. Because although certain elements of the press might be up in arms about us covering the most beautiful tracts of the West Country in ugly solar farms, we actually haven't installed very much photovoltaics globally compared to the volume of gigawatts of gas-fired power stations. And there's also some evidence that in the early stages for a new technology, the learning rate's actually higher. Costs come down more quickly. But, and it's a big, big, big but, there are all sorts of difficulties and caveats and reality checks that you need to bear in mind before you, in applying this kind of approach. You may think that you're starting from the point at which the technology is already as expensive as it's going to get, and then project a cost downwards. But in the case of offshore wind, you know, we projected downwards from what turned out to be the wrong base point. Costs went up when they were expected to go down. You need lots of market data in order to use this approach in a robust way, and that may not be available in all cases. You may get the learning rate wrong because your data may not be robust enough. There might not not have the quality that you need. You may think you're going to deploy lots of this thing that you think is going to get cheaper, and then find that actually you don't deploy very much of this thing after all, and so your projection for costs in 20 whatever turn out to be wrong. Sometimes analysts have used a proxy. So they've said, well, we've seen what's happened in onshore wind. We think offshore wind is broadly similar. And we've done a bunch of analysis that says that this technology is going to get cheaper. Again, that proxy may turn out to be flawed. And those conclusions may turn out to be wrong. Now, there's a big literature on all of this, and there's also a discussion about whether we should have single-factor or multi-factor learning. Should we try and disaggregate the different components of a particular technological system? How much is learning by doing? How much is learning by researching? Do we have spillovers from other industries? Is time a factor? Do we just wait until technological progress takes us along a certain trajectory without doing anything in a particular industry or sector or technology? So there's a big debate around all of this stuff. It can also be overwhelmed by other factors. So things like commodity prices, I'll come back to this, geopolitical or economic factors bear upon costs, bear upon prices. The alternative approach, and it's not kind of, I wouldn't want to present this as dichotomous, these are complements. The alternative approach is to use some form of engineering-based assessment, which could be parameterized and modeled, may draw upon expert elicitation, talking to the people that know and getting their views. It does overcome a lot of the difficulties associated with experience curves because they're very much kind of extrapolative methods, and obviously, as I'm sure you all know, we can extrapolate into absurdity and get ourselves into all sorts of difficulties. Again, they're still difficult to get right. I mean, I'm sure you've read the slide. There are judgment calls that are required, and I think it's probably not a particularly evidence-based thing to say, but I think it's probably a reasonable thing to say that policymakers, decision makers, CEOs and ministers are perhaps more comfortable with a piece of analysis that shows a bunch of data in a graph than they are with a piece of analysis that says, well, we asked half a dozen experts and this is what they all thought, perhaps. Okay. So just to kind of try and explain to you some of the data that we found. I'll just skip through some of this for some of these slides. So what we have here on the two sides of the I'm scared I'm going to push the wrong button again. These are for estimates of the day. So as we go through time to about now, we have a bunch of data for a bunch of technologies that at different points in time is either what we thought the technology was going to cost if it was largely hypothetical and we hadn't done it yet, like a new nuclear power station in Britain or a CCS, carbon capture and storage plant, or was the best guess of the analysts doing the work of what they thought the real price of these technologies was. And I would be just pause on that because often it's quite difficult to get market data. If you've got something like a PV module which is sold by probably in the millionfold now, a bit like a television, you have extremely good price data. You know exactly how much that thing costs. If you're talking about a bespoke project of which there are only 2 being constructed anywhere in the Western world at the moment, and the companies that are building those projects perhaps number at most less than a hand, fingers on a hand, and then negotiating with governments and funders and all the rest of it, you find that there isn't a great deal of proprietary. The data is very proprietary. And prices are very sensitive. We don't know necessarily how much it really costs to build a nuclear power station. So we use, so published data may be an estimate that was produced for the government and so on. But anyway, I've digressed slightly. So what this is showing is that upward trend which I referred to previously. And it's quite interesting to gather the data, and I think we had however many data points, Phil, 1,200 data points or something, on what we think might happen in the future. So this is bringing everything together and saying, well, what does this tell us? It tells us there's a huge scatter in the data as we look out into the future. It tells us there's a very wide range of views. And it tells us that with some exceptions, and this is gas, kind of doing what we currently think gas might do. We obviously don't know. We do tend to have this return to optimism. Now, is this because that was a blip? Or is this because these guys are absurd, head in the clouds, appraisal optimists who always believe that the sun will come out tomorrow? I'm not sure whether the report answered that question, but that was what we set out to try to do. Sorry, just to be clear, this is for levelised costs, pounds per unit of electricity delivered, and this is for capital costs. And the difference between the two slides is that this one includes photovoltaics. Photovoltaics obviously still tend to be considerably more expensive in terms of electricity delivered, particularly in the UK. But certainly we can see this remarkable downward trajectory over a period of about 10 years in terms of capital costs. I'm sure that many of you will be familiar with that story. The other thing I would just note here, we often think about the gas price increase as just that, solely in terms of the price of gas as a commodity. And what this neglects is actually there are dynamics at play within the market for power stations, which means that the price, at least, reported price of a CCGT has gone up. Now that might be because commodity prices have gone up, that might be because demand has gone up, that might be to do with deal making and all sorts of other things. But it plays into this policy conversation because it matters to, for example, the government deciding on how much the value of its new capacity mechanism for electricity will be, how much the least cost new entrant into the electricity market is likely to cost. How much more we're going to have to pay for our electricity to get people to build new gas-fired power stations, which we will have to do. Okay, some case studies. I'm just see if I can see the time. Where's the clock? Okay. So we have you know that already. I'll just run through what we have in it. So this is looking at the same two, same kind of two. No, it's not. It's looking at a slightly different set of things. This is looking at forecasts that were made in the past. So this, oops. So this is older forecasts, if you like, showing this kind of optimism through the 90s and so on, and then on into the future. And this shows after things got more expensive, more recent forecasts, what people thought was most likely to happen. And you see, well, we go up to a much higher starting point, which is still ridiculously ambitious and wrong, probably compared to where we are at the moment, and then we precipitously drop off. And I'll just leave you to observe that. And these are outturns over the last 4 decades. Okay, with some outliers. I'm happy to take a question about the nature of those outliers and deflect it towards Phil. CCGT, just telling the story that I told already, which is that we thought things would be largely flat, and they turned out to be, well, confusing actually, and varied, and that continues to be the case as we look into the future. Now, I think this is particularly interesting, given that we very recently have had additional developments with regards to CCS demonstration projects in the UK. And what we can see here, actually, and actually this is one of the things, I don't know how close you were to this, any of you, but the demonstration that actually was almost commissioned at the Longannet Power Station in Scotland, and that was at the last minute pulled, was pulled because it turned out to be about £300 million more expensive than it had been anticipated, and neither the government or the company concerned, Scottish Power, which is owned by Iberdrola, which was really broke at that particular point because of the financial crisis in Spain, they weren't prepared to stump up what was about a third cost estimation overrun. And what you can see with CCS is, as we get closer to doing something for real, our estimates of what we think that might cost tend to go up. Now, onshore wind, a bit like photovoltaics and a from a few slides back, has tended to be regarded, and not surprisingly when you look at that, as a great virtuous story of learning by doing and cost reduction and great hope and optimism for the future. An awful lot of that was delivered through the upscaling of turbines from very small, kind of almost like toy farm scale machines to gigantic, great big things that needed to have their own transport vehicles developed for them and ultimately could only be deployed at sea because they were too big to get up a hillside. Now we might be able to continue that trend, particularly offshore. We might be able to go for floating structures and all sorts of other exciting things. But what we've seen in the most recent period is a kind of plateau. Like we've done as much learning as we think we can and some other factors have come in. Many people consider onshore wind now to be a mature technology. There's a debate about when it will no longer need to be subsidised. Lots of interesting data that I think we can bring to bear on that conversation. Now, offshore wind, we did a separate report on offshore wind because we were so interested in this phenomenon. It hasn't done what offshore wind has done. It's done almost the reverse. And you can see a kind of typical 2010 estimate of mid-distance, mid-depth, roughly double the kind of early estimates and the early farms. We do still have this kind of optimism trajectory in the forecast data, despite that. I'm very happy to talk and take questions around offshore wind and what happened and what went wrong and so on and so on. But I think for the sake of time, I will resist the temptation to do that now. Photovoltaics. The table here is actually showing that what tended to happen in the photovoltaic sector is that the projections tended to turn out to be conservative. So people made a projection of cost reduction that turned out to be less dramatic than we found in practice. Okay, so that's the data that's reported in the documents, and I'm just going to run through now, I think, 3 slides with a bunch of themes that we came up with, concocted, to try and explain all of this stuff and try and pull some of this stuff together. The first type of theme is what we called methodological theme, and this, I suppose, in a nutshell, could be called getting your analysis wrong. So these are all of the things which you might need to factor into a learning assessment, or that might influence your learning assessment. Not just getting it wrong. Oops. Oh, God. Not just getting it wrong, perhaps tending to get it right. But so yes, there's a tendency for appraisal optimism. Technologies may be too immature. You may get your learning rate wrong. You may get your deployment factors wrong. You may fail to anticipate things that take place in reality. And so this is purely in the domain of assessing learning. There are things that you get wrong. There's 2 other themes that we've identified, though. The first of which we've called endogenous. And these endogenous factors are things that the analyst or the policymaker or the investor ought to be able to kind of put within their system boundary. It's within their control in some way. So, to take an example from the slide, physical environment, the cost and difficulty of moving from close to shore, shallow water offshore wind sites to much more distant, deeper and much larger arrays was underestimated in the early analysis of the cost of offshore wind. We've seen, for example, in the nuclear sector, that there are barriers to learning. It's difficult to get the kind of learning cost reductions that you might be hoping for if, for example, the regulatory environment continuously changes, or if you don't standardise, or if you try and pursue your own national champion program rather than allowing a kind of global winner to emerge, and a bunch of other stuff you can see, and I'm sure you can understand from the slide. Exogenous themes are, if you like, events, dear boy. These are things which are perhaps possible to anticipate, but maybe rather difficult to anticipate and then correctly quantify. So things like the movements of the macroeconomic cost input factors, like interest rates, like commodity prices, and like currency. There can also be very significant exogenous policy effects. So, for example, you may have a bunch of supportive policies in a region or a country that are trying to push the growth of renewable energy, let's say, but that might be overwhelmed by, and this isn't strictly true, but that might be overwhelmed by, for example, the early support that the US gave to its shale gas industry, leading to the emergence of a dramatic new competitor. Now, I should say that's a very imperfect analogy, but I think you can see the kind of the point. Okay, so this is discussed. All of these things are discussed at some length in the report, and now we just try and I'm just going to try and pull this thing together and put it to conclusion and take some questions. You can read that slide. I'm not going to try and talk you through any of that because I've said most of the things that you can see already. So what do we conclude? The cost of electricity generation can come down. So the fact that we've had some difficulties with cost reduction in the most recent past doesn't undermine by any means, by any manner of means, the longer historical evidence that shows that if you try to do something, you generally get better at it. And if you try to get better at doing something that just makes electrons, then the outcome of getting better at it is that you make the electrons cheaper. Or you might be making them greener and making them greener and cheaper at the same time. It is a bit different from making a widget or a car, which has qualitative attributes that might also be affected by learning. So we get better at making cars. We make cars better. We don't just make cars cheaper. And that's something which affects the electricity sector, I think, in a number of ways. However, it's not an inevitability that things will always get cheaper. And the quality of our analysis of how much cheaper they will get over time is a projection of a whole bunch of things that you can see on the in the grayed out first sort of sub-bullet on the slide. There is a tendency just to focus on learning and to neglect everything else, and that gets us into all sorts of trouble because everything else is what overwhelms learning. Okay, and there's lots of other more prosaic issues, as it says, like, for example, the congested supply chain for the offshore wind sector. Often, history suggests that things go over a kind of a curve. Things get more expensive before they get cheaper, and one of the difficulties of that is that the time duration of that curve may be decadal rather than the kind of few years that politicians are used to providing support for things for. And that's, I think, troublesome for the energy industry as a whole. I won't go through all of the things on the slide there. I would just perhaps single out the one size doesn't fit all point. We looked at a whole bunch of case studies. We looked at the evidence of learning as a generic phenomenon. We looked at individual technologies, and we came to the conclusion that some technologies are much better at learning than others. Some technologies have much greater prospects for continued cost reduction than others. And we discuss a bit as to why that might be. So finally, I mean, just thinking towards a policy audience here, forecasts are likely to be wrong. I think one of the things that you can always say about forecasts is that they'll be wrong, whether it's the weather or whether it's the long-term cost of a nuclear power station. And you've seen some of the things on the slide that, just reiterating, learning can be overwhelmed by other factors. There are more prosaic issues that need to be factored in. There is a very fundamental tension, I think, for policymakers that arises from all of this, because I don't think it's appropriate or helpful to sit on our hands and say, well, we're uncertain about the future cost of all of these technologies. We're not going to do anything. We're going to wait and see what happens, because that will assure us that we deliver nothing. I think there's a tension for, perhaps not for the world, but there's or Europe or the US, but perhaps for a small country like the UK, in that we try and back all the horses. And if you understand the kind of, basic arithmetic of of the betting industry, backing all the horses is not the way in which to win any money. And I think there is a danger that we fall into that trap as well, and just say, well, we'll put a little bit into everything then. And so I don't advocate picking winners, but it might be that you need a political will that if you have decided that, for example, you think CCS or the offshore wind industry or whatever it might be has strategic benefits for country X, Britain, then you do need to stay the course, because it will have uncertainties as you go along the road. Right, I think that's it from me.
I'll ask the first question, right? So I get the honour of asking the first question. And then we would like you to use a microphone to ask your questions, because we are recording you, so be aware. Rob, I mean, not my area, all this stuff, but very interesting and important. But tell me about cost of capital and how you deal with this issue of risk and lifetime, because one of the characteristics of new technologies is that they carry more risk. That makes it harder to borrow money, and it makes the technology more expensive. And how do you deal with that in this sort of work?
It's very, very difficult to deal with, to kind of disaggregate that thoroughly in a kind of meta-analysis like this. What you tend to find is that the kind of studies that we're reporting, and certainly so if we take, for example, Mott MacDonald or Parsons Brinckerhoff or whoever it might be that most recently did this kind of analysis for DEC, they will tend to assume that, at least for the more mature categories of technology, that they're all accessing a similar WACC. And then they will try and look at the different other technology characteristics which affect that. It's complicated. It's further complicated because policy can risk or de-risk the cost of capital as well. I'm struggling to answer the question in a more detailed way than that. Phil, got anything to add to that?
Well, let me pass you a mic.
Sorry.
I suppose all I'd add is that we didn't try to identify what the specific effect of the cost of capital on every one of the 1,200 estimates we had, because we didn't have time, and also because some of the studies don't declare what their cost of capital is for the levelised cost calculation, so it's impossible to do that. What I would say is that in the sort of studies that Rob mentioned from Mott MacDonald, Brinckerhoff and what have you, there is clear understanding of what the effect of cost of capital is, and in the sensitivity analysis, which they almost inevitably run in those reports, one of the sensitivities that is run is on the cost of capital. So I think that is, you do get the full, if you like, plausible range of cost of capital factored into the estimates you've seen there.
Yeah. Yeah, we won't. We'll.
Okay, so we've got a question over there first, and then a question over there second.
Hi, I'm Matt Hope. I'm a journalist with Carbon Brief. I've just got a couple of questions. One slightly more general, one technology specific, if you don't mind. Firstly, on the more general question, it's really interesting to see that you're going back and kind of going back over this analysis, acknowledging the cost estimates were wrong the first time and such like. Simple first question, why should we believe you this time? Why should the analysis be believed this time? Why should we have more confidence in the future projections now than we did before? And second question, more specific, technology-specific one is, you look at the levelised cost of offshore wind, and one of the problems you said before was you weren't quite sure it reached the peak before, so maybe that's why the cost carried on going up. I think on the graph it showed the peak about 2015. Why are you confident that the levelised cost peak will be 2015 this time?
I think you may have slightly misunderstood the nature of this report. We're not proffering cost projections, so we're not saying, well, these are the reasons that a whole bunch of other people got it wrong. This is our view, and we will be right. We are trying to understand the strengths and weaknesses of the various methodologies that have been used to make projections about the future. I mean, we do proffer the opinion, for example, that some of the more recent studies that have been done for the UK government are higher. I suppose this is I mean, in a short way of saying it, higher quality, have a greater degree of appraisal realism, are more carefully caveated and consider a wider range of factors than some of the studies that were done in a rather exuberant fashion in the early 2000s. So we do proffer that. I do think that's fair. This particular piece of work doesn't offer a view on offshore wind and doesn't offer a view on what we think the costs of any of the technologies we report on, what we think it will be. We report on the range of what other people have suggested that it will be, how that's changed over time, and then we reflect upon that as a kind of input to the policy and decision-making process to try and help policymakers, and particularly analysts rather than ministers or political advisors, to think about how to weigh this uncertainty. So that's what we're trying to do. We do have a report on offshore wind where we do give our best guess, which is a kind of disaggregated, sort of parametric representation of offshore wind, and we factor in a judgment call basically on what we think might happen to turbine costs, what we think might happen to foundations, and so on, and that takes us to I can't remember exactly what the figure is, but it's rather higher than the DEC industry Crown Estates £100 per megawatt hour, which was published a couple of years ago. But I mean, I'm happy to talk about that separately, but that's not the subject of this report. Okay.
Hello. Yeah, I'm just wondering whether or not you may be missing a trick with, or not necessarily missing a trick, but the element of gaming in these predictions, particularly with the feed. You might think, okay, this is an estimate from funded by DEC, but the inputs are still going to be coming from market actors. And it occurs to me, the more I sort of exist in this world, the more sort of like a big game of poker it is.
I agree, Mark. And I'll make an observation which is a slightly more academic observation about that, which is two things. I think the first is, yeah, we refer to appraisal optimism. Appraisal optimism might be because of the enthusiasm of the industry. It might equally be lowballing in order to secure. It might be very strategic and it might be deliberate. Certainly, it was a charge that has been levied at both CCS and nuclear in their early estimates. Possibly true in the offshore wind case. It's impossible to prove. And the other thing that I'd offer, because I meant to say this as we went through, a lot of this analysis uses price as a proxy for cost. And price is not necessarily a proxy. I mean, price and cost are the same if you're in a well-functioning competitive market that clears and removes any surplus or removes any market imperfections and so on. If you're in a market which is in scarcity, economics 101, price will go up. If you're in a market which is in any degree uncompetitive or monopolized, economics 101, rent seeking will happen and people will, prices will be above what they need to be. And that's always in there in the data and very difficult to extract.
Yes. Hello, my name is Kristin Hinnerud. I come from a Norwegian Climate Research Institute. In the beginning, you said that this kind of knowledge could help identify which technologies merit support and how much. And I'm thinking about various support schemes we have in Europe and elsewhere for renewable electricity. And in most EU countries, you have a price-driven scheme. So you fix the price and let the market decide the quantity. And then you need this kind of knowledge. You need these forecasts, and the authorities has to do as best as they can.
Yeah.
But if you instead said that based on this research you've done, you show how much uncertainty it is related to future prices. So perhaps we should rather switch to quantity-driven schemes, like tradable, renewable certificates or auctions, where you let the market decide the price. And then the authorities will have much less risk.
Okay, well, I mean, there's, as I'm sure you're aware, the UK is in the process of abandoning its renewable obligation, which is a certificate trading scheme. And whilst you know, the observation that you make is perfectly reasonable in theory and in principle, it's actually turned out to be not deliverable in practice. It's turned out that certificate trading is more risky, so it drives up the cost of capital, for example, and a whole bunch of other things that I don't really have the time, you know, so there's I suppose it's a kind of pragmatic, it's a pragmatic conversation, isn't it? It's an argument around what the evidence is in terms of who's over-rewarded and who's not, and it seems as if the tradable certificate schemes have tended to be economically inefficient, judged from that standpoint. I think that the judgment call that you need to make in order to set a feed-in tariff is not a judgment call about what you think technology X might cost in 15 years' time. It's a judgment call about what you think technology X, what's a reasonable price to pay for technology X now, which is a very different thing and ought to be easier to get right, but I accept that there are difficulties associated with it. And again, you know, with auctions, whether or not your auction will function effectively, efficiently, and provide, if you like, a revealed cost depends upon a whole bunch of contingencies. So the UK government has said, for its contract for difference, it would aspire for all of this to be delivered through an open auction process. It then backed away from that. For example, the nuclear industry, where there was one prospective bidder, if you have one bidder and you run an auction, you're not going through a price revelation process. Okay? Auctions, I mean, there's a huge literature on all of this. There's a huge literature on why certificate trading schemes haven't worked very well in practice. There's a significant literature on auctions, not just in the energy sector, but also, you know, across all sectors of the economy. Winner's curse, you know, so the sort of strategic underbidding, which then leads to problems that you can't deliver, because this is what happened in the UK with the NOFO. Hopelessly unrealistic lowballing of the bidding process, and then no penalties for delivery, which meant that things didn't get built. So I think, in my view, certificate trading schemes have proved to be very difficult to make work. We can look at feed-in tariffs and think about how best to make them as efficient as possible, and there might be a role for auctions in doing that.
Is there another question? Probably time for one more.
Hi Rob, Aaron Goethe from Post. So I understand you went through a systematic review. I see that you had some of the figures there from Mott and Parsons Brinkhofer. I guess I'm interested to get your view on whether or not there are some sources of information that you weren't able to get hold of from industry that may come out with different analysis.
That's a bit of an unanswerable question, isn't it? We don't, yes, I have no idea. I mean, I don't know how to say anything else in answer to that question. We could only go through the academic and sort of grey stroke policy literature and anything that was from the commercial sector that was in the public domain. It's obviously impossible for us to access proprietary reports on costs. When we did the work on offshore wind, we did do a bunch of conversations with the key industry stakeholders to try and get their perceptions, but that's as close as you can get. And it does come back to the point that Mark made, which is, you know, the government may wish to know what the cost of something might be, and it might commission Ernst & Young to go and produce a report for them. If Ernst & Young this go and ask under confident, you know, their bunch of mates in the industry, whether or not that's revealing the truth, I think we can all have a discussion about, but I can't say anything more about it now.
Okay, very good. I think that closes the session. Let's thank Rob very much for a very interesting lecture.